Well, thank you for the opportunity to be engaged with you. I apologize I'm not there in person. It just didn't work out with my schedule. I also know that you've had a great long day and you're ready for the weekend. So I'll try to be at least somewhat interesting and do this as quick as I can. And we can take some questions at the end. And if we finish early, I'm sure everyone will be happy. So for those who don't know me, I'm Dave Gessel. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Utah Hospital Association, and I've been there a long time, lead legal counsel and lobbyist. So really live in the world of healthcare policy, both in our state and nationally. And my presentation will kind of give you some thoughts on where we are nationally and locally with healthcare policy and politics, and some of the issues that will come up at the state legislature in January. So with that, let's start out. So not a surprise to any of us that Washington is really as polarized as it's been for most of our lifetimes. The closest parallel would be in the 60s and 70s, where a lot of the same challenges with riots and war ending and political upheaval, social upheaval was happening. Both parties have basically a more mainstream and a more radical's not the right word, I guess, but I'm trying to come up with a word with both sides, kind of fight over where they're going as national political parties. And we're all tired of that rancor, and it's not helpful in a lot of ways. Interestingly, there's a recent study out that the American media now ranks the lowest as far as trust of any developed country in the world. And that's because in the last half dozen to a dozen years, the vast majority of the media has chosen to take sides and basically show their political stripes rather than just try to stay in the middle and report. So where we go, I don't know with all that, but it's not been positive. And I have found that particularly in Washington, the more outrageous statements are the things that get the media's attention, honestly, whether they're true or not. And we're seeing a lot of that play out. And I'm painting everyone with that brush. It's not one party or the other. There are people in both parties and outside of the political establishment doing that. So hopefully we can return to a little better political discourse. But the reason I don't want to be a downer here, there's a lot of positives, but when you have this kind of divided thing, you don't really get a lot done. Now, there has been an infrastructure bill passed that's really been a decade or more in coming, and it's somewhat bipartisan. A very small minority of Republicans voted for it, but nevertheless, it's done. And we need, you can debate what's in it and whether it's all good, but there's a lot of money in there for basic infrastructure, new roads, bridges, dams, things we do need to modernize in our country. For rural Utah, there has been and will be more significant money for broadband to help more and more rural Utahns get to good access to the internet. So that's generally a positive thing. Interestingly enough, even though the Democrats control all of Washington right now, as you mostly know, very slim. That's even in the Senate. So the vice president has to break any party vote ties. The Democrats have a 9 or 10 seat advantage in the 435 person House of Representatives. So very, very close. And that makes it difficult for a lot to get done, which maybe some would like. But why I say the Democrats are more in trouble looking ahead, and that's why you'll see them push to get some other big bills done. And it'll be interesting how those play out over the next 6 months. But you have a current president that, pretty shocking this early in his term, we're right around a year. Today it was down to 36% approval rate in some of the polls. So there's only been one other president in modern times that's been that low a year in, and that was the prior president. So you can, both of those are examples of how polarized we are as a country. The Democrats could hold the U.S. Senate next year, but they can't even lose one seat. They have a number of vulnerable seats, as do the Republicans. Generally, the more people from not in the president's party are elected in the first two-year term time of the president. So history is against the Democrats, but the Republicans have more open seats. So it's a little hard to figure out that landscape this early. But the other landscape, I think it's pretty clear, unless the Democrats can have a remarkable turnaround in the next few months, that the Republicans are very likely to retake the House of Representatives in Washington for a number of reasons. First is, only twice in the last 100 years has a president gained more seats for his party after the first 2 years, or the president in power almost always loses seats, and oftentimes in a large way, 40, 50, 60, 70 seats switch to the opposition party. That's exacerbated by the Democrats because they picked up a lot in the past presidents in 2018, but those would be considered competitive, more moderate, if you will, seats. So the Republicans will have a chance to take many of those back. And on top of that, the majority of the states are finishing their redistricting process like we just did in Utah. And the majority of the state chambers are controlled right now in the country by Republicans. So they could easily pick up, not a ton, but 5, 6, 7 seats on it, almost just redistricting across the country. So, depending on your politics, and I'm not trying to pick sides here, I think there's a very high probability you'll have a divided government of some form a year from now. And that generally means that less gets done in Washington, which again, some like, and we'll see where that goes. But it's a little too hard to tell, but the things are lining up both on some what are perceived by the country as mistakes by the president and policies that aren't popular about how the war in Afghanistan ended, about what's going on at the border, about the money that's being spent and how it's being spent, and other issues that polls are showing a lot of independents are looking maybe at the Republican Party now rather than supporting the Democratic Party that they did this last time around. So you could see what's called a red wave build. We're kind of in a weird time right now. In the last 10 years, you've had a red wave in 2010 when Obama was president. You've had a blue wave in 2018 when Trump was president. I do think you're likely to have a red wave of some kind in 2022. So I give you all that background, just maybe hopefully of interest to you, but this informs a lot of the political debate and the decisions that will be made over the next little while. To specific Washington issues, I want to focus on a couple of things that we don't, one of which we don't talk hardly anything about now, and that is that the Accountable Care Act passed now 11 years ago by President Obama was really the biggest political debate in the healthcare arena since then, until at least the 2018 elections and until really COVID pandemic. And it's very clear now with what's happened, I think, with the pandemic and just the over time programs become more popular and entrenched, that I think you'll see that the vast majority of the Affordable Care Act, including the Medicaid expansion, is pretty much here to stay. There are a dozen or more states that haven't expanded, but those who have, including conservative states like Utah, it's pretty hard to see that they're going to roll the program back unless it becomes to the point they have to financially. The kind of scary thing is, or sobering thing, is that since the ACA passed, we are now up to almost 1 in 4 Americans that are covered by Medicaid. It was not meant to cover 25% of the country. It was really meant to cover the 10% that's truly poor. But nevertheless, here we are. That number will fluctuate up and down, but has really just gone up most years. So that will be really interesting. And the Democrats in their so-called reconciliation bill or social infrastructure bill will be looking to expand further in some of these areas. That's clearly going to be a very controversial bill to get passed. It will have to be party line votes. And, it's going to be interesting if that happens or not. And as far as other healthcare issues, of course, COVID is taken front and center. The main thing continues to be, the main thing I'll say there is probably don't expect a lot more money coming specifically to COVID related things. They actually used a fair amount of the money that is currently unspent in the prior 3 or 4 or 5 waves of COVID money for infrastructure and for some other things. So that horse has probably run its course. The other one is the vaccine mandates that are front and center for everyone if they are in a business with more than 100 people, or they're a healthcare organization that takes Medicare, Medicaid money. There are basically, there's more than this, but I'll limit it to two. There's 2 mandates that came out. One is from CMS, specifically on healthcare entities that take any Medicare, Medicaid money. As you know, CMS has tied that to they can actually kick hospitals or clinics out of the Medicaid or Medicare program if they don't follow that mandate. So you're already seeing most and many healthcare organizations move that way, and also they maybe prefer that because they know how good the vaccines can be. But just yesterday, 10 attorney generals, not the Utah Attorney General, that could still happen, but 10 states attorney generals just filed a lawsuit against that mandate. And there's a pretty even chance that there could be a stay on that short-term or long-term, or that Biden presidential mandate could be seen as overreaching and unconstitutional. So we'll have to see on that. That one's going to take some time, I think, unless there's a fairly quick stay, which means that they can't enforce it until the litigation is over. And I don't know how that will play out. The other one that affects everybody else and actually can affect healthcare entities, because it's neither of the mandates are fully clean from a legal standpoint to know, which you have to just do one or the other, both if you're a healthcare entity. But for all other businesses with more than 100 employees, through OSHA, there's a different process with OSHA. There's some of you maybe have heard, there's already been a lawsuit. And that, for whatever reason, they have different rules. OSHA, this kind of lawsuit can go directly to the Federal Court of Appeals, bypasses the district court, which can take quite a while. And the Fifth Circuit in Texas has already put a stay nationally on that mandate. But because there's other circuits that have had suits filed, within the next couple of weeks, they essentially do like the NBA basketball lottery, which if there's 3 or 4 circuits, they just do a lottery where they pick one that will hear all of the cases. And if that's the Fifth Circuit, then they're pretty conservative. It might rule against the Biden mandate. If it somehow gets into the circuit that covers California and the coast, maybe it goes the other way. And I don't mean to be political about that. It's just that there's probably good arguments on both sides that can be defended or a court could use to make a decision. So those are really the major things. I wouldn't look for a lot of other specific healthcare stuff. The Democrats are trying to add dental and vision and other benefits to Medicare, but the cost is of them alone, let alone all the other things they want to do, is looking like that they can't even get their own caucus, which again has moderates to very liberal together on. So we'll see where that ends up. I'm happy to take some questions in just a few minutes. But let's move on to the state, which I think we'll focus on, but we're happy to take questions on either state or federal. So in Utah, just expect more of the same, whether you like it or don't. But I do think the election of Governor Cox, truly the first rural governor that's, grew up in rural Utah for, 30 plus years, I think you'll see some large and small real benefits to overall to rural Utah in the next few years, not just in healthcare, but other areas. And just the way things are going, whether rural Utah wants it or not, they've kind of been found. And as you know, the housing's even going up there, and with the people being able to work remotely, which will, I think, continue for at least a number of people past the pandemic, and the other great things in rural Utah, I think many, not all areas, but many areas will see growth that they may or may not want, and probably not like St. George, but the larger areas, particularly those that have hospitals or campuses of universities, I think you'll continue to see really some good growth in rural Utah and some benefits. But politically, it's pretty well status quo, even after the redistricting that just was voted on by our state legislature. There are only 6 Democrats in of the 29 in our state legislature, and there was no real rancor on the redistricting map for that, and mainly because it gives the Democrats a chance to pretty well keep those 6, and there might be 1 or 2 that could switch to the Republicans, or the Democrats can pick up, but the Republicans will continue to have an overwhelming majority in our state Senate and in our state House, where it's 58 Republicans to 17 Democrats. Essentially what you had happen is most of the growth in Utah was in Republican areas, really. There was growth in Salt Lake County, even in the Democratic areas, but not as much as in like the southwest part, which is generally Republican. So Salt Lake County actually will lose a seat or 2, and those will shift to Utah County or other places in the state, but not a lot of extra advantage for the rural legislators. A little bit status quo, but compared to 20 years ago, there's a lot less rural-oriented state legislators, but pretty much similar than over the last 10 years. One last comment, just your civics for the day. Redistricting is part all the way back to our Constitution, the beginning, and it's always inherently been a political process in the sense that the party in charge of the state legislature in any given state has the constitutional right and ability to do those new maps. And gerrymandering came from a time many decades ago where a guy by that name was in charge in one state and literally did things like almost a snake-like district across, half of Utah or something, and to try to really advantage his own party. The truth is, if you even spent 20 minutes on the internet right now, you would find that Republican states are trying to keep status quo or help themselves, and Democratic states doing the same. Some worse than others, some more fair than others. But my statement in here that people call it gerrymandering when they didn't get to draw the maps, or they don't agree with the maps that were drawn. We all have our inherent biases. So my view on it is certainly the state maps for the legislature were done pretty fairly when you've got a party that's that far in power. They clearly could have tried to knock off a couple more Democrats in the Senate and a few more in the House, and chose not to do that. So might be cold comfort for Democrats because that doesn't give them a lot of opportunities to pick up seats either, but it keeps some seats that will pretty much stay in Democratic hands for a long time. The congressional map was more controversial with the public, but don't count out good moderate candidates of either party winning in a seat that people would now think is Republican or Democrat. That's what happened last time. The Republicans 10 years ago drew 4 districts thinking they were safe Republican, and within just a few years, Democrats held or won those seats. So nobody can predict the future. But I think it was a relatively decent process here. There was this independent commission, but again, under the Constitution, even under our state laws and Constitution, that group was just to recommend to the legislature. They couldn't make the decision because we're in a representative representative republic, that's how we've set it up and that's how it works. For most of us, or at least for a lot of people, surprisingly, the COVID economy the last couple of years has actually helped a lot of businesses. Now that might be because a lot of money was pumped in by Washington, but a lot of people have been able to weather it, a lot of companies quite well. There's clearly significant minority that, it's been really rough depending on the industry they're in and where they were when this started. Clearly some have lost jobs and lost businesses, but on a macro level, at least in our state, it's actually done really well. We're continued for good economy and growth in the foreseeable future. We are now becoming a state that our problems are growth, not a bad economy, but the growth brings its own challenges. The state budget, both in the healthcare and Medicaid area and many other areas, will be very in good shape, and they'll have literally hundreds of millions of dollars they still have to spend or could spend. And some of that is COVID federal money that they don't have to spend. There's not a time limit on that for another like 3 years. So bottom line is the next year or two, I think you'll see a robust government or state budget with new money going into a lot of things. That's not even including the money, probably, I can't remember, another $3 billion is going to come down for roads, bridges, mass transit, things like that. So there's a lot out there. Now, the downside is that I can't even get my arms around the fact that in the last 10 years, we've probably gone from a 10 or 12 trillion deficit as a country for our government to about a 28 trillion. And both parties are at fault. Both parties have done it. COVID somewhat at fault, but when and if are we going to have to pay more taxes or reduce services or whatever to get out of that debt? And I don't think anybody knows, even the economists. We still have many countries that have a worse debt to GDP ratio than we do, but we're getting, I think, in areas we have never been before and don't really want to be. I think we even have a worse ratio than we had in World War II, where that was the biggest time in our history where we had a lot more debt to our GDP. I know we're all tired of COVID. Who knows when we'll be done with it? You now have some of the national pundits saying they think we might be done with it, at least any more surges and things by Christmas. You have others looking at next spring. The one 100 years ago, it took about 2 years, and that would be next spring. So I think we are on the downhill slope, but we don't know how many moguls there'll be in that. But a couple other thoughts that I think we've learned the hard way. It's almost like the abortion debate, in my view of doing this for 30 years. People have hardened their views on COVID and masks, and there are very few people that will change their mind on where they are on that. And so what does that mean? That means we have a lot that do wear masks and are getting vaccinated, but we've got still a strong minority in this state that don't like either of those or haven't done them or won't do them. And what that means is if we get to herd immunity, it's mostly going to be coming through vaccinating children, which is starting to happen, and more people that choose not to be vaccinated getting COVID. So I don't know when that will be. As I talk to a myriad of physicians here, I hark back to the first physician I talked to when this broke out 2 years ago almost, or a year and a half ago, and he said, it's already big enough, it's gonna be like the flu. We're gonna have to get annual shots. And I do think that'll happen, and I think for many of us, that'll be a great day if it gets to that point where we don't have to mask and we just have to get our annual shot. One of the concerning things of the hospitals has been this second surge the last couple of months. While the death rate, both the actual numbers of cases and death rate isn't as high because we've learned a lot in this last year. but the ICU use is just as high as the worst times on any given day now as it was back in, December and January before people were vaccinated. So that's a real concern of the hospitals, and the vast majority of those that are COVID related, they're people that chose not to get vaccinated and then have become deathly ill. And we can't seem to, even though we tell people, it's like we're just talking to a wall, and they don't seem to make the connection between that and wearing masks or getting vaccinated. So I think that's just how it's going to play out in our state. Some good news that also was forgotten, kind of like the ACA, because this happened right before COVID hit. January 1, 2020, Utah did go to full Medicaid expansion. There is a good funding for the program for that expansion. They have good reserves in place that should stay for the next few years because some of it's tied to sales tax funding that we all agreed to pay. And when when there was an initiative to put this into law, back to the good times in the budget, I think you'll see some the normal increase, or maybe a little more than normal of, we're hoping for 4%, it might be 2 or 3% in Medicaid funding overall, not just for hospitals, but ACOs, for other providers. Couple of clouds on the horizon that are probably out at least a year to 2 years is two things that the federal government did on COVID is they expanded the match rate for states by 6.2%, which meant that Utah, instead of paying, say, for every Medicaid dollar, Utah would be paying 30 cents and the federal government pays 70 cents. Now that's kind of up to 76% federal, 24% state, but that will go away in the next few years, which will mean the state's got to put back money in there or cut services. So I think they can manage that piece of it. That happened in the Great Recession 10 or 11 years ago. They managed through that okay. The second one that is unusual, that we don't know what it means, is that early on in COVID, as part of this money and match, the federal government said the states cannot kick anybody off of Medicaid that's currently on Medicaid. So Utah has gone from 300,000 to, I think, about 420,000, 425,000 or more people on Medicaid. And part of that is due to the expansion, and a lot of that's due to adults without children that meet certain poverty requirements that finally have now insurance under Medicaid. But because they can't take people off, there's a lot of what I'd call phantom people on Medicaid. In other words, you could have up to 50 or 60,000 of those 125,000 that are still on the Medicaid rolls, but really aren't, that they're not costing Medicaid anything because they're not using Medicaid because now they have insurance from an employer, or they've moved out of state, or whatever it might be. But that'll be something within the industry and the Department of Health and others, legislature will have to work through once we have a little more flexibility from the federal government. And that's a little unknown as to how much budget impact that might have. For the upcoming session on healthcare issues, it's a little bit challenging to see a lot that's coming forward, partly because the last two sessions with COVID have turned into kind of the legislature only want to do the things they absolutely have to get done, not pick fights that they don't feel they need to do that year, and just get done the budget and other policy issues that really have to be done. There's a little bit of that still going on, but I think there's a little bit of, okay, we've had a 2-year break from a lot of these healthcare debates. We're going to get back into them. Bottom line, what I've listed here are some of the bigger issues to watch. COVID will always be there. They've kind of done most of what they can do as far as mandates and liability and other things. So might be more tweaking some things, or unless we have a huge uptick again. There's always some licensing fights between different healthcare professionals. Should be a few of those again. Mental health funding and policy has really improved the last few years. That will continue. There'll be a lot of discussion on that. A new one that hasn't been much recent discussion, but it's really bubbled up, is how do we maintain and expand our healthcare workforce? Is, we've kind of lost some people because it's been so hard under COVID, and there's just so much competition with other industries. There will be a bill, I think, too, that will make it a higher criminal penalty to assault a healthcare worker. We've seen a little uptick in that in the second uptick in COVID this last few months. It's been disheartening for healthcare providers because a lot of them feel like they've gone from being respected and heroes to now being literally spit upon and denigrated and seen as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Workers' compensation funding for hospitals could be another issue. It's hard to tell, but that could be a big debate potentially. So there's a variety of things. The abortion issue could be back as well. But I've used up most of my time, and I hope I haven't put you to sleep. So happy to be done and either take questions or let you get out of class early. I really can't hear unless you go to a mic or something.
So any questions for Dave? We want to thank Dave for his presentation today. As usual, it's always so insightful. And Dave, you wouldn't mind if we share this with our participants, your presentation?
Be happy to. Thanks for letting me.
Thank you. Well, big round of applause for Dave. Thank you so much for joining us remotely, Dave. As always, it was very, very educational. And we appreciate the work that you do on behalf of healthcare throughout our state. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for being here today. It was a great conference. We're excited to do this again next year. Next week, we want you to celebrate National Rural Health Day, National Rural Health Week. Tell everybody, check out the photos.